As we begin, I want to be certain that everyone has the text of the Second Inaugural in their hands. If you don't, maybe you could put up your hands and we'll be sure to get a text to you. Some hands are going up, so if we can get that text to people, I'd like to have it in your hands. Okay. I'm deeply honored at the invitation to be speaking with you this afternoon. And I want to pay a special tribute to John Sellers, the president of this organization, as I refer to John in my acknowledgments, the point man at the Library of Congress. John, by his simple presence, opened up to me by telephone, by cajoling a person that many people had not known before in terms of Lincoln scholarship, and I'm deeply grateful to John for all that he has done. In that same spirit, every day as I worked on the Second Inaugural, I found myself conscious that I was standing on the shoulders of Lincoln scholars, past and present. I felt humbled, as one does in the Western United States when one is following the trail of eminent pioneers. And so if I at times deviate from those trails, perhaps try to cut a fresh trail, it is always with appreciation of those who have done such solid work in this field. Abraham Lincoln considered the Second Inaugural to be his greatest speech. 11 days after offering it, he replied to a congratulatory letter, "I expect the latter to wear as well, perhaps better than anything I have produced." But then he went on to add, "But I believe it is not immediately popular." Hold that thought. I'm going to come back in about 25 or 30 minutes and ask you your opinion as to why, if Lincoln thought this was his greatest speech, he perceived that it was not immediately popular. In speaking about Lincoln in recent weeks, mostly in the West, I've been asking the question, how many of you have seen and read the Second Inaugural at the Lincoln Memorial? I'm sure if I asked that question in this audience that every hand would go up. And I've asked people for their experience, their emotion in being there at the Lincoln Memorial. You recall, even though it's close to us, that we rise on those steps. We see that majestic statue of Lincoln. If you turn to the left, you see the Gettysburg Address carved in Indiana limestone on the south wall. If you turn to the right, you see the Second Inaugural 3 panels carved on the north wall. Would some of you be willing to say, what are your experiences a few weeks ago or a few years ago as you have visited the Lincoln Memorial? Tell me what your experiences are. I can repeat it for others. Yes?
We went to the Lincoln Memorial a week after September 11, and reading the last paragraph with malice towards none, I think Lincoln was saying, we have to be careful who we venge our anger towards.
She suggests that going to see the Lincoln Memorial and the Second Inaugural after September 11, a week after, that it causes us to pause as we think about how are we going to respond to those who are perhaps viewed as our enemies. Other responses. It's hard to see sometimes with the bright lights, but I'd like to get some more responses. Yes, sir.
I believe today we're not all reading the same Bible that people were at the time that the Second Inaugural was delivered.
They were reading the same Bible at the time the Second Inaugural was delivered. As I've asked that question, I've had people respond with words such as awe, wonder, amazement. Yesterday afternoon, my wife and I wandered over again to the Lincoln Memorial and walked up those steps and stood there in preparation for today just to get a sense. I observed when I was there the sort of facial expressions of people. I noted that, I'd never done this before, I noted that most of the people were there observing the Gettysburg Address. Far fewer people were reading the Second Inaugural. Part of what I'm suggesting is that the Second Inaugural has lived under the shadow of the Gettysburg Address. We all know something about that address, of the epic battle that took place July 1, 2, 3, 1863, of the hasty preparations to have a dedication ceremony in November. I'm sure most of us know that Edward Everett was the invited speaker and that he went on for more than 2 hours. that Lincoln spoke for only 2.5 minutes. Gary Wills has attempted to set us straight on, did he write it on the flap of an envelope? When did he write it? But all of that kind of contributes, doesn't it, to our amazement and engagement with the Gettysburg Address. I want to suggest here this afternoon that the Second Inaugural has an equally dramatic context that somehow has been lost to us. We don't visit the Second Inaugural in the way that today millions of visitors visit the Gettysburg Address. Well, we do visit the Lincoln Memorial, but it doesn't quite have the same sense about it. Think for a moment. A nation has just conducted an election while it is involved in a civil war, almost unprecedented. The nation is aware, we have forgotten, that this is the first re-election of a president in 32 years in a nation that is only 76 years old. I'm not sure if I asked the extra credit question that you could answer who were the presidents in the 1840s and 1850s. Walt Whitman wrote a draft of an address filled with epithets about those who had been presidents before Lincoln. And he looked forward farther into the future for an 18th president who would one day set the nation's wrongs aright. The nation was filled, if you read the newspapers as I did, every single day, the front page is filled with the exploits and the victories of Grant and Sherman and the Northern commanders. We have forgotten that Lincoln's first words at this second appearing, what an amazing sentence. It is not 7 years ago. It's not the way he begins his other addresses, but he didn't expect to appear. In August of 1864, the Republican National Committee convened in the Astor Hotel in New York City. They communicated their results to Lincoln at the White House. They told him that today he would lose Illinois by 50,000 votes. There was no possibility of winning Pennsylvania. He would be soundly defeated in New York State. And then Lincoln took this information, and on August 23rd, he went to his cabinet. He had written out a memo. He didn't let them see the memo, but they signed the back of the envelope in which the memo was contained, and it said in these words, "When we are defeated for re-election, it will be our duty to cooperate with a new president that the nation might succeed." Take this address in your hands. The words that are most familiar to all of us are the last paragraph. If you turn to the second page, I found myself about 3 weeks ago appearing in a coffee house in Berkeley, California. I didn't have my rings in my pocket. The speaker in the first hour was speaking on advanced sex tips for girls. It was a wonderful event filled with irreverent music and all sorts of things, and I thought, how in the world are we going to transition to Lincoln? And as I sat there with a live studio audience, and this is broadcast on FM around the United States, my host stunned me by saying, "Dr. White, would you be willing to read the entire Second Inaugural Address?" Well, I'm making the point that Lincoln wrote for the ear. Most people today write for the eye, and we need to hear these words. I suggest at the beginning of my book that we need to say these words out loud. I was in Springfield several weeks ago to sign my book in the restored old Capitol building, and the next day I went for the first time, I must admit, to the Lincoln Herndon law offices. I knew this from reading about it, but now I heard it from the guide that as Lincoln would come into the law office in the morning, he drove his partner Willie Herndon just to oblivion by sitting down, spreading out on the couch, and reading aloud. We teach our children to read to themselves. Lincoln had a sense for the sound of words. Listen to the last paragraph. "With malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and a lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations." Now, I've just broken the rule that I'm trying to put forward in my book. My complaint is that that particular paragraph has been excerpted and put in American history textbooks and in books of documents, totally ripped away from the 3 paragraphs that went before. In fact, some scholars have gone so far as to suggest that it has little meshing with what went before. Not so. It grows out directly of what Lincoln had said in the first 3 paragraphs. But before we're ready to hear these words, would you come with me to Washington in the first week of March in 1865? We need to be there with the crowd to prepare ourselves to hear these words.